My name is Alana Beal. I'm the class of '08, and I am a member of the steering committee of the Cornell Jewish Young Alumni Network. And I'm so thrilled to see so many of you here this evening. So just a few announcements before we get started with our main event, why we are all here to hear the fabulous Ryan Earle. So you guys each should receive a quarter card, just like this is Hope Plaza, at your seats. So please save the date. There is a Cornell Jewish Young Alumni Network sponsored Shabbat dinner on Friday, April 5th. We would love to see all of you and your friends there. So save the date. Also, quick spiel. These events are sponsored by Cornell Hillel, and on Cornell Giving Day, which will be some unannounced day this March, so keep your eyes peeled for social media blitzes and email blasts. Please join us in donating to Cornell Hillel. Your support will help enable Cornell's Jewish community to thrive on and off campus at events like this. So we really appreciate you guys taking that into account. And also, please do not hesitate to reach out to me or any of the other committee members in the room or Susu Cohen, class of 2012. If you would like to get involved in planning one of these events or getting involved in our committee, we are more than happy to have new faces and new voices. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Ryan Earle, class of 2007, to give us some fun facts in Jewish history at Cornell. For some reason, my prepared title was not selected, which was far above Chayuga's waters. So Corey is uniquely positioned to give this talk. I knew him as a good friend of mine from my days on the Hill, but many of you may know him from when he was a visiting lecturer, which he still is, in the American Studies program, where he teaches history, American Studies 2001, the history of the first American university, a class exclusively about the history of our fair Cornell. He is also a staff member of Alumni Affairs, and he is an all-around exemplary Cornellian. So it is my pleasure to welcome Corey to speak with us this evening. Thank you so much.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. How many of you took my class when you were students? All right, so maybe a half. That's a pretty good turnout. Welcome back. This will not be graded, so you're in luck. They really aged me with the photo they used for this. I stole that joke from Zach, but thank you. So thank you for coming. I'm going to tell you some fun facts about Cornell, a little bit of Jewish history at Cornell as well. More of a sort of fun facts and highlights than a history of Jewish life at Cornell, but there will be plenty of time for questions at the end. Feel free to raise your hand or shout things out as I go as well. If there's something you're wondering about, that's fine as well. So for those of you who don't know me, I do teach a 400-person class at Cornell on the history of Cornell University. Started doing that in 2011, called the First American University. And I've had over 2,400 students in the last 7 years. It's been a lot of fun to meet a lot of students doing this, but also to help them understand what makes Cornell special, what makes Cornell unique, and help build some pride and sense of community among Cornellians. And I hope those of you who took it feel that way. We learned things about, early Cornell faculty looking like Harry Potter characters. What's the deal with Dragon Day? Did Cornell really have a holiday where everyone just pelted each other with mud and beat each other up? And why did Cornell have a brain collection? Or why does Cornell have a brain collection? So all sorts of random fun facts. Happy to answer any questions about them towards the end as well. One thing whenever I give a lecture somewhere that's not in Ithaca is I like to tell people that Cornell is everywhere and find some example of that. So today we are at 570 Lexington, this new space in New York City that is connected with Cornell, the new ILR Conference Center. I think officially opens next week. So you are one of the first Cornell events in this new space. But Cornell truly is everywhere. For instance, this building also has the offices of the Teagle Foundation. Teagle being a Cornellian, Teagle Hall named after him. Another fact about this building was that in 1920, a bunch of Cornellians apparently rigged a giant microphone to the top of the building, a giant giant speaker, and blasted a congrats or sort of a message to Cornellians who were traveling to the UK with the track team. They were going to compete at this annual event in the UK with the Oxford-Cambridge track teams. And so the Cornellians rigged a giant speaker to the top of this building and blasted, good luck, we send our regards kind of thing. thing, paging the Cornell cross-country team paging the Cornell cross-country team. So that would have been rather interesting to see a giant speaker on top of this blasting that out. You can see in the background of this photo also the Chrysler Building, obviously, and so it's worth pointing out that the Chrysler Building is owned by Tishman Speyer, which was founded by a Jewish Cornellian. Robert Tishman, class of 37, founder of one of the largest real estate businesses in the world, current owners of the Chrysler Building. So number of Cornellians wherever you go. In fact, anyone know who this is? No one knows who this famous Cornellian is? So this is an image on the Chrysler Building, so you can see about halfway up where these gargoyle eagle heads are on the building. And this is Margaret Burke White, who was class of 27, another famous Jewish Cornellian. She was the first female war correspondent in the United States. Her photos were on the cover of the very first issue of Life magazine. She's considered one of the 100 most notable Cornellians because she was such a pioneering photojournalist and journalist in general, but also did these crazy photos from the Chrysler Building where she crawled out on top of these gargoyles and took photos of the city. So another little Cornell Chrysler Building fact. And so here's where we are right now in the city. So you've got the General Electric building where we're located at 570 Lexington. And we're actually between some other Cornell-connected buildings that I thought it was worth pointing out as well. Not only is Cornell history everywhere, but famous Jewish Cornellians are everywhere as well. So you have 488 Madison, a couple blocks to the east, and you've got Pod 51 Hotel, a couple blocks to the west. So 488 Madison, also known as the Look Building, was developed by the Uris brothers, famous Jewish Cornellians. One of them was a Cornellian. The brother Percy went to Columbia, founded the Uris Building Corp. Were one of the major developers of skyscrapers throughout New York City. There are Uris buildings all over the place. Uris Hall, Uris Library, named after the Uris brothers, Harold Uris, who was a generous philanthropist to Cornell. And then Pod 51 Hotel, a couple blocks to the west from where we are right now, is owned by a Cornell hotelier, Ira Drucker. Actually, I don't think he graduated from the hotel school, but owns a series of hotels. And launched the Pod brand of hotels, and also a notable Jewish Cornellian. He's on the board of overseers for the Museum of Jewish Heritage as well. So, like I said, Cornell is everywhere you go, and I encourage my students always to find those Cornell connections where they end up. So I'm going to start and talk a little bit about sort of religion at Cornell in general and the place that Jewish life comes from in terms of Cornell history. And so we'll start with an easy question for all of you. What is Cornell's motto? You should all know this. Okay, I heard a few. There's the shortened version, but the full version, well, first of all, we should compare it to a few other illustrious or not so illustrious institutions. So Harvard's motto is Veritas, which is truth in Latin, kind of, full of themselves, maybe not the best motto. And I'm a little disappointed that none of my students hissed, because they learned in my class you're supposed to hiss or boo whenever Harvard is mentioned. Dartmouth University, or Dartmouth College's motto, who knows what that is? Anyone? There you go. Someone knows their Dartmouth history. So Vox Clementis in Deserto, which is a voice crying in the wilderness. Why you would ever want to go to a school with a voice crying in the wilderness as your motto, it seems like a strange choice. But they maybe not the most welcoming and inviting. But then you have Cornell with, I would found an institution where any person can find instruction in any study. A much more welcoming, inviting motto than our peer institutions. We're also the only Ivy League school with a motto in English, so certainly a little more accessible in that sense. And as my students know, Cornell was really founded to change higher education in the United States. It was founded to be an accessible institution. It was truly founded for any person, for any study. It was founded to change what the higher education system looked like in the US. And so very intentionally, they picked an English motto that sounded very different than what the peer institutions had. And so today we'll touch a little bit on this any person aspect on the motto. What did they actually mean by any person? Did they truly mean any person? What was their intention there? I sort of break it down into 5 different elements. So one of them is any gender. They intentionally chose the word person and not any man, like a lot of other universities' charters used, because they truly meant any person. And so Cornell really led the way. It was the first Ivy League institution that was coeducational. In fact, it was coeducational long before many of our peer institutions. This image is of the women's crew team. You can see they are mocking their place in what was perceived as a man's world. They dressed in men's attire for their team photo this particular year because they thought it was funny that they were a women's athletic team at a time when pretty much no other schools even had women's athletics, and even at Cornell, they were significantly outnumbered by men's athletics. But when you look at the timeline of schools becoming coeducational, you can see Cornell is in an entirely different category than most of our peer institutions. Columbia doesn't become fully coeducational until 1983, which is pretty ridiculous. That's not that long ago. And Cornell, the first woman enrolled in 1870. So you can see we were considerably ahead of our peers. And Cornell really became a model for other institutions. At the time, there was all sorts of criticism, in particular a Harvard University study that said brain work would, academic work would ruin the brains of women, that their brains just weren't, set up for studying in classrooms. And this was a Harvard Medical School study. And so many people were concerned that Cornell was coeducational, was going to allow men and women to study in classrooms together. These, ridiculous things. One person claimed that women would start riding bicycles if they took classes with men, and other horrific things. So there was a lot of concern, but Cornell showed that no, it's okay, that you can have a coeducational institution, and it did not make the men womanly and the women manly, as some people were concerned about, although women did start riding bicycles, so I guess that concern was legitimate. Any person also meant any race, so they intentionally used the word person to refer to any gender and any race as well. Remember, Cornell was founded at the close of the Civil War, 1865. Race is a hot topic in the United States at this point. And the founders of Cornell intentionally wanted truly any person to be able to enroll there. This image is of Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity, which was the first Greek letter intercollegiate fraternity for African American men, and it was founded at Cornell in 1906. Any person also meant any nationality. Cornell's entering class had international students in 1868 when Cornell opened. In the 1800s, Cornell was called the most cosmopolitan university because it had so many international students in the student population. This is the Chinese Students Association, which was founded right at the turn of the century because there were so many Chinese students at Cornell at this point. And so that was something that Cornell prided itself on. From the start, there were international faculty at Cornell. Faculty were recruited from around the world to come to Cornell, and they brought students who they knew from their home countries. In fact, in the 1870s, there were so many students from Brazil on campus that there was a Portuguese language newspaper published as a student publication on campus because one of the professors in geology had recruited a bunch of students from Brazil where he was doing geology work. And so there were Portuguese language newsletters and a Brazilian student organization in the 1870s, shortly after Cornell opened. A fourth element of any person is any socioeconomic status. So Ezra Cornell, poor farmer, wanted to make sure that the other poor farmers of New York State could get a world-class education. So he had made, who knows where Ezra made his fortune. I left out the basics of who Ezra was. I figured this crowd's a little more knowledgeable than average. Yes, Telegraph, exactly. So Ezra Cornell makes his fortune in the Telegraph, but he grew up really in poverty, a pretty poor family. His father was a potter and a farmer. So we really wanted to make sure his new university was committed to people who couldn't afford higher education elsewhere. Cornell had one of the very first work-study programs in the United States where they said, look, if you can't afford tuition, it was about $20 those first years. It's changed a little since then. But they said, if you can't afford it, we'll put you to work on campus. So early students actually helped level the art squad. It was this sort of muddy pasture, cow pasture at the time. They helped build the sidewalks and did carpentry work in the buildings. McGraw Hall in the middle there was under construction when Cornell opened those early years, and so students helped carry stone from the slope where it was quarried to lay the foundation for the building, did work to actually construct the building that they then took classes in. And that was one of these early work-study programs. In fact, that's why Cornell Tradition, the work-study program on campus today, is called Cornell Tradition, because this was this tradition that Ezra Cornell wanted from the start at the university. And then the fifth element of any person is this any religion aspect. And this was actually the most controversial part of Cornell's founding. So Cornell was doing a lot of things pretty radically. The name of my course, The First American University, it's a term that an educational historian used to refer to Cornell as this radical institution that did all of these things a little differently. This any person idea, any study. And Cornell wasn't necessarily the first school to do each one of these things. The first to be coeducational, the first to be non-sectarian, the first to have sort of practical subjects alongside classical subjects, but it was the first to do all of these things together in one institution. And today we sort of take these things for granted. Most colleges and universities are coeducational, non-sectarian, have sort of a public engagement mission, which Cornell had from the start. And so Cornell really became what we think of today as an American university, and that's where that term, First American University, comes from. But the religion part was really the most controversial part of it. So Cornell was attacked in the national press. Prominent clergy people around the country, prominent newspaper editors called Cornell the godless institution because they said when it opened it was going to be non-sectarian. They said that truly any person was welcome. You can be of any faith or no faith at all, and that's okay. So we became the heathens on the hill, the godless institution, all sorts of nicknames. They said if you send your kids to Cornell, they'll go straight to hell, their lives will be ruined, Cornell will corrupt them. There were all sorts of ridiculous claims, and some students actually came to Cornell because of this. They saw the publicity and said, oh, it sounds kind of like an interesting place. I'd love to go there. So no such thing as bad publicity. And so this image is of Sage Chapel, but the image on the other side there is of class statistics. And it used to be that the university would publish these class statistics of each graduating class, and it would list, how tall you are, and do you have a mustache? It would ask all sorts of random questions. And most of them asked what religion you were. And you can see this one goes from Hindu to Hebrew to heathen. And so at any other institution in the United States, if you said you were a heathen as a student there, you probably would have been thrown out. And you can see some people left it blank, some people wrote none. There's a pretty wide range of religions on there. And this was very unusual for a college to allow people to truly be of any faith, any religion from the start. Cornell had at least one Jewish student in the entering class. So when Cornell opened in 1868, there were 412 people in the entering class. That included transfer students as well as entering new students. It was the largest entering class of any university up to that point. So it got a lot of public attention just because this was a big university. At the time, the other schools were much smaller. Obviously, they've grown over the years. But Cornell opened as a truly coeducational, non-sectarian university that was doing all of these things a little differently. Ezra Cornell actually spoke about religion a few times in the early years, both Ezra Cornell and Andrew Dixon White, the first president of the university. And so there's a few quotes that I thought were worth mentioning. How many of you are familiar with the letter in the Sage Chapel cornerstone? So those of you who took, a lot more of you raised your hand saying you took my class than raised their hand there. So you forgot it, but Gabe raised his hand in the back. Thank you, Gabe. I appreciate that. You seem very confident in knowing the Sage Hall cornerstone. So this was a letter that Ezra Cornell wrote and placed in the cornerstone when Sage Hall opened. Sage Hall, who knows what Sage Hall opened for? What was it built for? So it was built to be the women's residence hall, basically. It was Sage College for Women, and it was the first residence hall on campus. Before that point, most students were living downtown. There really wasn't a college town at this point. There wasn't a West Campus or North Campus. And so when Cornell said, we're truly going to be committed to coeducation, they built a residence hall right on central campus, and it was considered the best residence hall in the country, this fancy Sage Hall, to attract women to campus, to show that Cornell truly was coeducational. And so when they dedicated the building, they had this cornerstone laying ceremony, and Ezra Cornell said, I'm writing a letter and I'm placing it in this cornerstone, and this letter will say why Cornell University will fail if it does fail, which I hope it doesn't. And everyone assumed that this letter was about women, about coeducation, because that's what the building was about, that's what they were getting criticism for at the time. And no one read that letter. He wrote it, stuck it in the cornerstone of the building, and it wasn't until the 1990s, so 120 years later, when that cornerstone was opened and the letter was finally read. And that was when Sage Hall was renovated for the Johnson School, when they completely gutted the building and sort of rebuilt it with the exterior clamped back onto it. And so the letter was opened, and the letter was actually about religion. And so this is early 1870s. Ezra Cornell was under a lot of attack still for this godless institution, for Cornell being coeducational or non-sectarian. And so while people thought it was about coeducation, it was also actually about this non-sectarian element of the university. And so he writes in the letter, "Coeducation of the sexes and entire freedom from sectarian or political preferences is the only proper and safe way for providing an education that shall meet the wants of the future and carry out the founder's idea of an institution where any person can find instruction in any study. I herewith commit this great trust to your care." And he writes about sectarian strife in this letter. And he really felt that the attacks on the university for being a non-sectarian institution, that was going to be what brought down the university. At the time, the university was struggling. The enrollment numbers were going down. There were still attacks in the press. And Ezra actually dies a year later and never really gets to see the university flourish. But he was truly worried that sectarian strife or religious strife was going to be the downfall of Cornell. And I think today we can say the university truly is non-sectarian and has lived up to his goal of making that happen. Andrew Dixon White also spoke about Cornell's non-sectarian nature in 1874. He said, "We have several Jewish students in our institution, and among them some of our very best students. I would never sanction anything which would infringe upon their privileges, deprive them of their rights, or tend to degrade them in any manner." And so he made a pretty strong statement early on. While most other universities would not allow Jewish students to attend, he said, no, truly Cornell is open to any person. And this was when he was testifying in the New York State Senate when he made this statement. He was asked about Sage Chapel on campus because Sage Chapel was a non-sectarian chapel, which was a very unique thing, a chapel that, although it has pretty clear Christian imagery, it was to be open to any student and bring speakers from all different faiths to speak there. So there's Sage Chapel early on in Cornell's history. You can see it looks significantly different than how we all remember it on campus. It's expanded a number of times over the years, and the steeple is no longer there, sadly. It was damaged in a storm and then removed in one of these additions that were added to it. And the little house next to it there, that was the house of the first professor of architecture who designed the chapel. So he got to live right next to his work. It was quite convenient for him, Charles Babcock. And so Sage Chapel, here's another interesting part about the chapel and its non-sectarian nature is when they added the mosaic and the artwork at front, the mosaic, the first level of it is completely non-sectarian. So there's no religious imagery in that first level of the mosaic. It represents Cornell's founding ideals. So it has a man and a woman representing coeducation. It has one side representing the arts and one side representing the sciences in an attempt to show sort of Cornell's any study nature. It has characters representing truth and beauty and other elements. So the goal was to represent Cornell's motto instead of having religious imagery in that mosaic. So that was another unique part of the design of the chapel, although much of the rest of the chapel does have Christian imagery. Early on, there were rabbis who spoke at the chapel, were people of all different faiths. Here's an article about Emil Hirsch speaking at the chapel from the 1890s. He actually came twice in the 1890s. The Sun describes him as probably the ablest Jewish rabbi in America. So they thought he was a pretty big deal, or at least the ablest Jewish rabbi at the time. And it's around this time you begin to see the Sun commenting on Jewish students on campus a little bit more often. Here's an article sort of explaining what Passover is to students at Cornell, saying that Passover is beginning and here's what it is. And so it's around early 1900s, turn of the century, that begin to see more of a Jewish student population at Cornell. It was pretty small for much of the 1800s. Cornell did have one of the first Jewish faculty members in the United States at a college or university. So that was another sort of unique pioneering thing for Cornell. Dr. Felix Adler was on the faculty for 2 years from 1874 to 1876. And Cornell had courses in Hebrew in its very second year, 1869. Hebrew was taught at Cornell. Felix Adler taught the origin and history of religion, philosophy and its relation to religion, and the Jewish religion and literature when he was on the faculty for those 2 years. From 1896 to 1932, Cornell had a professor of Semitic languages and literature. 1957, Cornell had a professor of biblical and Hebrew studies. They brought Hebrew back after a couple decades without it being taught at Cornell. And then you see sort of the beginning of the current departments on campus, founded in the 1960s. The Department of Semitic Languages and Literatures becomes Near Eastern Studies, 1977, and the Jewish Studies program begins in the 70s and sort of grows throughout that decade. So a little bit about the academic side of Jewish life at Cornell. Jewish student organizations grew significantly in the early 1900s. Sigma Delta Tau, an Alpha chapter founded at Cornell, so the national fraternity was founded at Cornell. But there are a number of other fraternities and sororities that chapters were founded at Cornell during the early 1900s. Pi Lambda Phi was actually a non-sectarian fraternity, but almost all of the members were Jewish, so it was about 95% Jewish, but it was called itself a non-sectarian fraternity. And at the time, most other Greek organizations were Christian organizations. And so many of these chapters were founded at Cornell because Jewish students were facing discrimination from the Greek system otherwise. In fact, within the Panhellenic system at Cornell, rush for Christian sororities and Jewish sororities was totally separate until 1949. So for quite a long time, there was a totally separate rush process, a segregated rush process. This also shows one non-Greek organization. So the Menorah Society in 1912 was founded at Cornell, which was actually a chapter of a national organization, but sort of a predecessor of Hillel at Cornell. And Cornell's president came and spoke to them right after they opened, and he said, "I'm glad to welcome the Menorah Society in Cornell, not alone because it makes us conscious of the great contribution of Judaism to civilization, but it is particularly fitting in this university. We would be false to our ideals if we allowed ourselves to become victims of particularism. That is the comprehensive note of the university." And he goes on to say that this truly represents, Cornell's founding ideals, that we have Jewish student organizations on campus at this point. And the Jewish student population grows significantly in the 1920s, early 1900s, and the Ithaca community was very supportive of that. Many of the Greek chapters were founded with help from local Ithacans. And the campus and local community joined together for the founding of Temple Bethel downtown in 1929. So the Cornell students were very involved with the founding of the temple in Ithaca. And it's actually in 1929 that CURW starts at Cornell, Cornell United Religious Work. Up to that point, it was called the Cornell University Christian Association. And they decided that as the Jewish population was growing, they truly needed to be an interfaith department. And CURW was actually the very first college interfaith department at any college campus in the country. So also, much like Cornell, became a model for other institutions for interfaith programs on a college campus. And here's an article about Temple Bethel being dedicated, and you can actually see they mentioned the Hillel Foundation is being founded at Cornell at the same time. So that year is when Hillel comes to Cornell University at the same time as the temple opens downtown. Annabelle Taylor Hall opens in 1951, and that's when Jewish student life has a home on campus finally, so it's opened as an interfaith center on campus, and so Hillel begins to have offices on campus beginning in the 50s, so it takes a little while for that to happen. Now, I was going to mention a number of notable Cornellians. There obviously was one in the title of the event. So I was looking at different notable Jewish Cornellians, and there are obviously thousands who I could mention here. It's a long list. So I decided, all right, I'll narrow it down to those who were mentioned in the book, The 100 Most Notable Cornellians, which was by Professors Kramnik, Altshuler, and Moore, published in 2003. I already mentioned Margaret Burke-White, the photojournalist who's mentioned in this book. But as I was looking through it, there are tons of Jewish Cornellians in this book as well. So we don't have enough time to mention all of them. So I'll highlight just a couple notable Cornellians who maybe you aren't familiar with, maybe you haven't heard of. If you haven't read this book, there are some interesting Cornell alumni that you might not know of. So a couple of them, Joyce Brothers, member of AE Phi at Cornell. She was a pioneer of pop psychology. She really was the predecessor for Dr. Phil, Dr. Laura. They both cite her as their inspiration. She created the field of pop psychology, basically. She hosted a TV show and a radio show that were nationally syndicated for 30-some years. She did this. Really introduced the idea of psychology to the public and a number of principles of psychology, and so pioneered this field and led the way for a whole industry. So a notable Cornellian that you might not be familiar with. And then a few others worth mentioning. Anyone know of any of these? Some of them, the names you should recognize. So Henry Heimlich, Cornellian, class of 41 of the Heimlich Maneuver, medical school, class of 43. He was drum major of the Big Red Marching Band as a student. Anyone know who Laura Hobson was? Laura Hobson's considered one of the 100 most notable Cornellians as a novelist, and she wrote the novel Gentleman's Agreement, which popular best-selling novel, New York Times #1 bestseller, had a movie made of it, and it's actually about anti-Semitism in America, and sort of touches on sort of her experiences, and so a commentary on society at the time. Alan Funt, class of 34, anyone know who he is? So I see one hand. Alan Funt is considered as the creator of reality television. So he is the founder of Candid Camera, which was really the first reality TV show, led the way for a whole industry of reality television. He's a Cornellian. He donated all of the Candid Camera collections to Cornell. The University Archives has the complete Candid Camera collection. That's quite the alliteration there. And so those of you who took Psych 101 with Professor Moss, you would often show clips from Candid Camera and use them to teach psychological principles. So the Department of Psychology is the keepers of that. Anyone know who William Friedman is? So he's the guy in the middle there. The names are clockwise. So William Friedman was one of the founders of the NSA. He was their chief cryptographer when they were founded. He cracked the Purple Code during World War I. Notable cryptographer and pioneer in sort of national security. Oh, and then the last person there, I didn't mention Isidore Rabi, was a physics Nobel Prize winner. So another Cornellian you might not be familiar with. But there are many more that I didn't mention as well. And of course, the one that you're all here to hear about, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, everyone's favorite Cornellian Supreme Court Justice, there speaking at a Cornell event. There's her yearbook photo at Cornell. She was involved in a number of Cornell leadership roles as a student at Cornell. Anyone know what the WSGA was? Exactly. So women had their own student government at Cornell for many years, up through the 1960s, I believe, the WSGA existed, because Janet Reno was a leader in it as well when she went to Cornell, class of 60. And so Ruth Bader Ginsburg actually led a committee for the WSGA, which was like the Career Services Committee, the Women's Vocational Committee. Here's an article about her bringing a famous lawyer to speak on campus, who was a female lawyer, graduate of Cornell. At the time, there were very few women lawyers. And so she brought her back to speak to the women on campus about careers in law. The thing that amuses me about this article is it says her committee conducted a poll of students on campus, of the women on campus, to see what careers they were interested in. And law is not one of them at all. But she brought back a lawyer anyway, because that's what she was interested in. So, but interesting that law was not on the list of careers that the women on campus wanted to learn about. She came and spoke on campus twice in the 1970s, and I was amused by the articles advertising her talk, because the Daily Sun got the title of her lecture wrong both times in two different ways. So legal problems of women and women in the league profession instead of legal profession. And then in the second one, it was the legal professor instead of the legal profession. So the Daily Sun has not changed in quality over the years either. It's okay, I wrote for the Sun too. How many of you have seen the new movie On the Basis of Sex? So whenever I go see a movie that potentially has a Cornellian in it, I try to find as many Cornell connections as possible. And I was rather disappointed that this movie picks up 2 years after she graduated from Cornell. And so did not have any Cornell mentions or direct references at all. Plenty of Harvard screen time, but Cornell missed out. So I wanted to highlight a couple things that are somewhat indirect connections to Cornell in the film. There's a picture of Ruth and her husband, Marty Ginsburg, early on, so you can see how well the likenesses were in the film there. Marty, also a Cornellian, class of 1953. The movie does spend a lot of time at Harvard highlighting the fact that she was one of very few women at Harvard Law School. And so I think it's worth making a comparison to Cornell when we're talking about women in law schools. So Harvard, the first woman entered their law school in 1950, I believe it was, while Cornell, the first woman entered the law school in 1891. So considerably different timeline there for women in law school. At Harvard, the first woman to be editor-in-chief of their law review wasn't until 1977, while at Cornell, the first woman to be editor-in-chief of a law review anywhere in the United States was Mary Donlin of Donlin Hall fame. She was class of 1920 from Cornell Law School. So it shows you some comparisons between Harvard Law and Cornell Law. And there's Mary Donlin with the board of editors of the Cornell Law Review, looking very perturbed at the group of men standing next to her. She's the one in the corner there. But there were two women on the board of editors there. You can see one on each side of the photo. Ruth Bader Ginsburg's class at Harvard Law. So you see a few other women in her class. At least one of them was a Cornellian who went on to be the first female dean of Loyola Law School. So that was one of her classmates at Harvard Law, graduated a few years after Ruth from Cornell. Kathy Bates in the film plays Dorothy Kenyon, a notable pioneer in women's law, women in the legal field. And she actually came and spoke on campus a number of times at Cornell in the 1920s. This is one article about one of her talks where she came and spoke about legislation relating to the home and the family. So relevant to the film, certainly. But it was interesting to see that in the 1920s, long before the movie, the time period the movie's depicting, she was coming and speaking at Cornell. And then the big finale of the film, spoiler alert, is Ruth Bader Ginsburg doing this one particular case, which is Moritz versus Commissioner of Internal Revenue. And so obviously Ruth Bader Ginsburg is listed, but there's another Cornellian. And so in the film, there are two particular villains that she's up against, representing the IRS, or Commissioner of Internal Revenue, the government. And so you see Bozarth in the film, and the other one is, what's his name, Ernest Brown. But there was another member of that legal team who was a Cornellian, a Jewish Cornellian, Meyer Rothwax, who got his undergrad and law degree from Cornell. But unfortunately, he was not depicted in the film. And then, of course, it shows Marty Ginsburg golfing a number of times in the movie, usually in their apartment. And he was a member of the varsity golf team at Cornell. So that is accurate. There's an article mentioning the exceptional play of junior Marty Ginsburg at Cornell. The team in particular, I think, didn't do very well during his years on it, but he was sort of the lone star on the team. So in 2018, there were 3 feature films that featured Ruth Bader Ginsburg. There's a little cameo in Vice. There's the documentary, RBG, and then there's On the Basis of Sex. But do you know what film she's going to be in 2019? Exactly, the Lego Movie. The latest commercial does show Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Unclear if she will be voicing the character, or not character, I guess, but voicing herself or if someone else is. But Ruth Bader Ginsburg will be in another feature film in 2019, which we're all very excited about. And so at this point, I'll finish, before we get to the questions, with many of you may be wondering, why was Oreo in the title of the lecture? A fun fact about Cornell. How many of you know why Oreo was mentioned in the title? So, all right, maybe half of you, not bad. So the Oreo is kosher because of Cornell. So how many of you took Joe Regenstein's class? So a few of you. Food science professor, he's emeritus now. He founded the Cornell Kosher and Halal Food Initiative. And so he's worked with countless businesses to help them go kosher, be certified kosher. And he worked with Nabisco, worked with Oreo to make sure that their processes were kosher. I think this was the mid-90s that happened, or late 90s. And so you can thank Joe for Oreos being kosher. He also worked with the Dairy Bar over the last, I think it was just a few years ago, that the Dairy Bar became kosher thanks to his efforts as well. So that's the Cornell connection with the Oreo from the title. And so at this point, I'll open it up to questions. Anything and everything you want to know about Cornell, things I didn't talk about, happy to answer anything at all. Thank you. Question here? Yeah. Oh, we have a mic. Okay.
I turn it on. There's a little button. So I know that the floor cleaner pledge comes from Cornell Greek life. Do you know with the S.C. Johnson family, were they known for being hazing? Was that why it's pledge?
Well, they were members of Chi Phi, was it, I believe? Does anyone know for sure? Chi Psi, okay. So one of the two. So those of you who know Chi Psi can decide for yourselves whether they're known for hazing or not. But yeah, the story is that the product pledge was named that way because the members of the S.C. Johnson family knew that from their fraternity days, pledges had to clean the floors at the fraternity. And so at the S.C. Johnson Company, when they developed a cleaning product, they named it Pledge. I've tried to find some sort of definitive source that says that's the case, and it seems to be sort of more of a myth. I can't find anything of the actual Johnson family claiming that, but so unknown whether that's a true story or not, but it seems to be in enough places that it might have some truth to it.
Who was the first Jewish president of Cornell, and how many have there been?
First Jewish president of Cornell, was it Jeff Lehman? Yeah, okay, so so I believe there have been 2.
Are you counting?
And Martha Pollack, Jeff Lehman, am I missing one? Oh, David Scorden, yeah, so 3, I forgot Scorden, yeah. So 3, the 3 recent ones, with the exception of Beth Garrett, yeah. How did I forget Scorden? So, good question.
I just wanted to know about Mud Day from the
You want to know
opening
about Mud
slides.
Day?
Yeah, I
Okay,
didn't know that.
so it used to be when you talked about hazing on campus, it was about inter-class hazing, less about Greek hazing. And basically the freshmen and the sophomores would just beat the crap out of each other, and that was like a big part of the Cornell experience. From 1800s through the 1930s or so, there were elements of this. And so for a while there was a sophomore vigilance committee, which would go around and police the freshman rules which were enforced on campus. So various freshman rules where freshmen couldn't walk on the grass. Freshmen couldn't sit in the front rows of the various theaters and concert halls around town. Freshmen had to always wear a freshman beanie. So you were given a little freshman beanie, all freshmen wore that. If you were caught without the beanie, the sophomore vigilance committee would see that you were taken care of. And so the mud rush was one form of this sort of interclass hazing where they would gather the freshman and sophomore students on campus on a particularly muddy day. They'd pick like the ag quad or one of the quads that was nice and muddy. And there were different variations of it. Some were cane rushes, so there'd be like a cane that represented the class, and the students would just go beat each other up until someone broke the cane or stole the cane or tried to get the cane from the other class. And these would result in broken bones and all sorts of injuries and clothes being ripped off students. And there are lots of ridiculous photos of the mud rush. And eventually the faculty and the students as well sort of decided this tradition maybe wasn't representing Cornell in the best light, and maybe to sunset that one. But a lot of these traditions lasted into World War II, and really it was the veterans coming back after World War II that ended a lot of these traditions, because suddenly you had a lot of students coming back who had been through war, were much older than the other students, even though they were freshmen. They were older than the sophomores, juniors, and seniors, so they weren't going to have any of that. And so a lot of those sort of traditions disappeared when the veterans came back and had more of a serious tone on campus. Yes? Did the university ever get the stump back? So how many of you know what the stump was? So there's actually a plaque near Ho Plaza that recognizes the stump. And so it used to be Ho Plaza. The whole walkway was lined with beautiful elm trees. They all died from Dutch elm disease in the 50s and 60s. But there was one tall stump that was left in the middle of Ho Plaza that basically was a poster board for campus, as well as a soapbox for protests and speeches and things like that. It was kind of a centerpiece of the campus. Think of quarter carding today. The stump was the middle of quarter carding on campus. It was sawed in half at one point. A fraternity stole the stump and took half of it. It was found in Treman Park or something like that, away from campus. After disappearing for a little while, and the campus grounds department reinstalled the stump on the stump of the stump. And so they tried to hook the piece that was sawed off back onto it. It lasted maybe 6 months or so, and then they ended up getting rid of the stump altogether.
Yes, you forgot the best part of the story.
Okay.
When they stole the stump, they put a sign on it that said, if you ever want to get your stump back, you have to leave. I forget what the ransom was, but they
Okay.
asked for a ransom.
Sounds like you know an awful lot about this. I don't know. I'm not sure the perpetrators were ever caught. But.
Is there any truth that Goldwin Smith was an anti-Semite?
That's definitely true. I think there's lots of truth to that. Goldwin Smith was sort of the Ann Coulter of his time. So he was a political pundit of sorts. And was an essayist and published in all sorts of national magazines and things. And so wrote a number of things that were pretty anti-Semitic. He was also anti-coeducation, so had some issues with a number of Cornell's founding principles. He was brought into Cornell early on as what was called a non-resident professor. And so when Cornell opened, it was this upstart school doing all these radical things, and they needed a way to get legitimacy and credibility easily. And so Andrew Dixon White, the president, came up with this idea of let's invite a bunch of really famous, eminent scholars to be non-resident professors. They come to campus for maybe 2 or 3 weeks at a time, give a series of lectures, but then they can go back to wherever their home is. So a number of notable individuals served as non-resident professors. Goldwin Smith was one of these first ones. He was the Regius Professor of History at Oxford, so a very eminent academic scholar. So the fact that he was suddenly on the faculty of Cornell gave Cornell a lot of credibility in those early years. He was only a member of the faculty for, I think, 3 years, pretty short time, but did leave his estate to Cornell, was very generous financially to Cornell, but had a number of views that were pretty against Cornell's founding principles. And there's some evidence that he sort of pushed against Cornell being coeducational in those early years as well, when the faculty and the trustees were debating, are we truly going to live up to this any person ideal and admit women? He was on the side. He was actually the one who worried about women riding bicycles. That quote came from him. But he was a pretty negative guy in general. If you read some of his essays or quotes, like every quote is him just complaining about something. When he was hired to Cornell, he said, "I hear there are a number of waterfalls, which I abhor." He hated waterfalls. He complained about the Yankee bread. He just all sorts of things he would complain about, and so yes, that is definitely true.
There's an irony to that is the building that's now attached to his building is named after a Jew.
Exactly, and Seth Klarman actually spoke about that at the dedication of Klarman Hall. He brought up the fact that the building named after him is attached to this building named after a pretty notable anti-Semite, and he said he thought that was appropriate. He said that it's only right that a Jewish alum's building is going to be part of this other building, and so it's something that's fairly well known on campus. I feel it's been written about every now and then in the Daily Sun, or Glenn Altshuler and Isaac Kramnick wrote about it in the Cornell Alumni magazine maybe a decade ago. But yeah, the building's still named for him. Yeah.
Did Cornell have quotas on Jewish students like other Ivy Leagues did at the time?
Cornell did not have any official quotas, so unlike Columbia, Harvard, schools that had definite quotas, there is some evidence, particularly in the medical school and in arts and sciences, that there were kind of unofficial quotas in the 1920s, 30s. So you begin to see sort of a rise of intolerance nationally and on college campuses during this time period, both for students of color on college campuses and for Jewish students. And it definitely affected Cornell. Cornell's fourth president, Livingston Farrant, was probably the weakest president in the sense that there are a number of instances where he had an opportunity to make a statement about sort of Cornell's founding ideals in any person. And in almost every one of these instances, he sort of was wishy-washy and let some intolerance happen on campus. And so this happened at one point when 2 black students weren't allowed to live in Sage Hall because the white students didn't want them to live there. And he said, well, it's out of my hands. It'll be awkward for everyone. I don't want to deal with it. While a decade earlier, Jacob Gould Sherman, Cornell's third president, had said, no, I don't care if all the other students quit. We're truly committed to any person. And so you see that as well. There's some correspondence where they begin looking at admissions. And it's at this point that Cornell begins limiting the freshman student population. So they say, all right, arts and sciences, we're only going to take 500 students. And then they start saying, we're going to look at things like personality and character. And so there was no official quota, but it's pretty clear if you look at the evidence that they were looking at the number of students from New York City, the number of students from different places. They were looking at names of students and saying, well, we're going to limit the number of students of different, we're going to say it was character or personality. We didn't think they fit in with the campus culture, but was pretty similar to a quota. Yes.
So you're net ID, right? That means
Yes.
you're the 8th person with CRE, right?
Right.
What is like the most common? Like initial, and then like 999, whatever.
That's a good question.
Do you know?
I mean, the people who don't have a middle name tend to have pretty long ones. So I know a number of people who have 4-digit net IDs. So there are a few of those at this point. But usually it's people with just two letters, or for whatever reason their middle initial didn't get put in their net ID. But I do not know what is the largest net ID. That would be an interesting thing to find out. I'm going to look into that. That's a good question. Mine's easy to remember because it's create. Took me till spring freshman year for someone to point that out to me. But
We could line up later by net ID number and see.
there you go.
who's
Yeah, we
the
can see who has the. Does anyone have how many have a 3-digit net ID here? How many have a 1-digit net ID? All right, so the people with rare initials. Anyone have a 4-digit? All right, so we know who has the highest net ID. There we go. What is it? 2499. Okay, so they go up pretty high. Huh. It's just not part of your net ID, yeah. Excellent question. I learned something new too. Yeah.
So on Stewart Ave, there's a little sign in, and on the sign it has TV and air conditioning and flaw. What is flaw?
Flaw? FLA?
Yes, my friends have been and I have been wondering since we were sophomores.
I don't know. Does anyone have any idea? Is it cut off? Was it like a word that... You've got a photo, okay. I'm fascinated. Air conditioning? Oh, TV, FLA. It looks like it must be like some sort of certification or like, what would FLA stand for? I don't know. Yeah, any hotel, yeah.
I think it has something to do with their certification with the hotel industry.
Yeah, maybe it's Finger Lakes something or some sort of, yeah, certification or professional organization. You stumped me twice tonight. Wow. Yeah.
Hi, could you speak a little bit about the history of the kosher dining hall on campus, 104 West?
Sure. So some of you might know this history more than I do, but so there used to be sort of Jewish co-ops on campus that were founded called Young Israel. There were two different Young Israel co-ops, and those were sort of the predecessors of the Center for Jewish Living. And then 104 West opens. Do you know the date when it opened?
Late 80s, early
Yeah,
90s?
Yeah, it was right around late 80s. Norm Turkish, I'm sure many of you know Norm Turkish, was really the driving force behind the kosher dining hall. There had been a couple experiments with it before then. At one point, there was one of the Young Israel houses had a kosher dining facility in it. At one point, there was a college town eatery that was providing kosher food for the Jewish students on campus that worked out an arrangement with Young Israel, I believe. But yeah, Norm was the one who led the effort and I believe helped fund the effort for kosher dining at Cornell and 104 West. And it reopened in 2003, 2004. It was renovated and sort of reopened and re-affiliated with Cornell in the early 2000s, but the predecessor was opened around late 80s. Yeah, you might know more, yeah.
I'm enjoying, but you missed again the best part.
I missed the best part, okay. This is why you're here.
So in the same spot as 104, there was Young Israel when I was in school. And it was very unusual for Young Israel, which is an organization mostly of synagogues, to have any affiliation with any organization on a campus. It probably was the only one. And at one point after I graduated, the boiler in the building broke, and they wrote to Young Israel saying, "We need help, we don't have the funds." And they said, goodbye. And that was the end of the affiliation with Young Israel.
Okay. Did not know that. I should mention Milton Convitz, too. He was one of the founders of the ILR school at Cornell, and he was one of the leaders of Young Israel, kosher dining at Cornell, the Jewish community. He was one of Ruth Bader Ginsburg's favorite professors, but a pretty influential figure on the faculty.
Hi, can you talk a little bit about Chabad on campus?
I don't know a lot about Chabad on campus. Some of you might know more than I do. Anyone? Anything in particular? You're just...
It just seemed like very different from Hillel, so I was wondering.
Yeah, I don't know how far back that goes. Anyone? Yeah, Brandon?
I think they're technically like an affiliate of Cornell,
Okay.
but they're actually part of the university, which is why it's Chabad at Cornell versus it's Cornell Hillel.
Ah, okay.
So they're only like associated with, not actually a part of.
Technically, we're both affiliates of the university, but we're housed in CURW and they're not.
Okay. Eleanor.
Do you know anything about any trends in like anti-Semitism on campus, either like from the founding history to now, and then also like I wouldn't say race relations, I guess like interfaith relations, particularly around World War II and the Holocaust? Did that play a role in Ithaca?
That's a good question. Obviously, there were the incidents last fall that were nationally publicized and brought a lot of attention to anti-Semitism across the country on college campuses, and Cornell wasn't immune to that. In the early years, the first 50, 75 years, when you read the memoirs and diaries of Jewish students on campus, they were pretty well integrated into the community. And I think in part the Jewish community was really small at the time. And so they were welcomed in student organizations. And it's really not till the 1910s, 20s, 30s when you see more intolerance on campus. And you begin to see different organizations not allowing Jewish students to be part of them, certainly within the Greek system, which is why you see a number of chapters of Jewish fraternities and sororities founded at Cornell. But even other organizations on campus, you begin to see them shutting out Jewish students. I don't know, I'm trying to think of anything I know around like World War II. I know that the Cornell community was very supportive of Jews abroad, and you see a number of fundraisers and things during the war where Cornell is sort of rallying to support people around the country affected by the war. So you do see some sort of joined together around that sort of thing. And interfaith relations, I mean, CURW is a great example as a pioneering college interfaith program. The Interfaith Student Council was founded just, 3 years ago on campus? 4 years? Pretty recently, right? You were among 2 years ago? Yeah. 3, okay, yeah. So that's a pretty new development, that there is an Interfaith Student Organization. But it used to be CURW actually was led by a student board. And so it was much more of a big student leadership position, and there would be student leaders from different faiths on campus. So 1930s through 1970s or so, you'll see the CURW student board listed on a lot of people's yearbook entries and things. And so that was a major leadership position that brought together people from different faiths, and it was pretty similar to the newer iteration of it.
Can I offer a fun fact?
Yes, please.
So CURW is Cornell United Religious Works, and the Dean, Father Dan of Cornell United Religious Works, has a new title.
Yes,
His title is now
that's
the
true.
Dean of the Office of Spirituality and Meaning Making.
It's a great new title.
So it just shows that the definition of religion on campus is kind of expanding and growing in an
That's a
interesting
great
way.
point, yeah.
Any
Yeah, and the
more
sign
questions?
outside Annabelle Taylor now says Spirituality, Offices of Spirituality and Meaning Making, not CURW. Anything else? And I'm happy to answer questions afterwards. Feel free to come ask me anything that you didn't get to ask. Oh, there's one more. Oh, no. Pete Galbo. Sure.
Yeah, Corey, there's a bench in the arts quad that says above all nations is humanity. It's sitting right outside of the hall. Just talk about, is there iconic placement of that for a reason outside of that hall? And other things that carry icons around.
That's a good question, yeah. So that is the oldest bench on campus. As far as I can tell, that is the oldest bench. Above all nations is humanity. And it was a quote attributed to Goldwin Smith. He's the one who gave the bench to Cornell. The quote ended up being picked up by all different organizations. There was an organization at Cornell called the Cosmopolitan Club, which was the international student organization on campus. And their motto was above all nations is humanity. They became part of this larger national group that kept the motto above all nations is humanity. The University of Hawaii, I believe their motto is above all nations is humanity. There's a bench at another university in the Midwest that's identical to the bench that borrowed it from Cornell. An alum of Cornell liked it so much he made a copy and put it on this other campus. I can't remember what campus it is. But a lot of people have pointed out the irony of it being a quote from Goldwin Smith, who maybe didn't necessarily live up to this aspiration of believing above all nations is humanity. But so there's some appropriateness of it being there in front of Goldwin Smith and perhaps reminding Mr. Smith of what he said.